Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, I don't know if you saw my text. I'm on my phone for Zoom because even though I just made that Zoom account and I know what the password is, it says I don't, so.
Well, hi, Steffi. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Seneca. I just wanted to thank you guys for signing on to the UNM divestment complaint. We really appreciate your doing that.
Yeah, well, thank you for helping to organize it, and yeah, I know we have several of our steering committee members and Yucca members at UNM, and so it really meant a lot to them too. So thank you.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so we met with the AG, and they've been very encouraging, and they're overworked and understaffed, and so they want us to keep feeding them information about what companies are doing in New Mexico and all over the world. So I'm continuing to do that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's kind of crazy that it kind of falls to the community to do that work, but I'm glad that you're doing it.
Well, and I'm so thankful for all the NGOs that compile all that kind of information. It's terrific. So do you guys have any legislative priorities that you know of?
Jonathan is actually Yucca's policy lead. And so they can explain a little bit more about, like what we're looking at in the upcoming session. And some of our
so a lot of what we're focusing on this session is kind of really showing up against the false solutions that we're seeing proposed here in New Mexico. So just different things like hydrogen, we have, net zero pledges, carbon capture, just all these things that we know aren't the right solutions and aren't real solutions at that. And then we have some things that we will be supporting, some just different things around like voters' rights, and sorry, I'm still waking up. But yeah, just different. I have a whole presentation, so I will be happy to get into it here in the next few minutes.
Okay, yeah, I finally pulled up the slide. So this is just talking a little bit about our kind of view on hydrogen as well as just legislative priorities. If you're good to go for it, Jonathan, or unless you need a couple minutes.
Wait, I'm confused. Did you want me to just start this part now, or?
I think so. We also had a little kind of intro to Yucca, but I don't know. It seems like you may already be familiar. Also, hello, Tiffany. Thank you for being here.
Everyone, thanks for having me.
Hi, Tiffany.
So I guess I can go ahead. I'll just give a quick overview of kind of Yucca and where we're coming from, some of our previous priorities, and what we've been demanding, so it can help kind of frame Jonathan's piece. So we're a group of young BIPOC people from different communities in New Mexico, but we're mainly concentrated in northern New Mexico, and we're entirely youth-led. So we are dedicated to holding our elected officials and leaders accountable to creating a just transition to a livable, green, sustainable future. And so we do that through a lot of different ways, through direct action, civil disobedience, marches and protests, and policy and electoral politics. And so all of these kind of different wheelhouses, different puzzle pieces all kind of fit together to help move our larger campaign forward. And so these are the demands that we originally organized around, and only one has been met so far. So we're largely kind of on the same page as we were when we started. But it's, creating a just transition from oil and gas to pay for research, planning, and implementation to end our state's dependence on fossil fuel revenue, supporting comprehensive climate legislation to achieve 100% renewables by no later than 2030, with the understanding that nuclear is not renewable energy, a moratorium on fracking, community solar legislation, which I think, as you may know, passed this last year, which was super exciting. And then calling on the governor and other elected officials to declare a climate emergency, sign on to the Equitable and Just Climate Platform, as well as the Green New Deal, and to pledge to stop taking fossil fuel and utility monies. Yes, this is kind of where we started from. and just quick like highlight reel of some of the things that we've done to kind of help push that forward. So this is the thing that we first organized around. It's the global climate strike. This was back in 2019, and it was in coordination with Greta Thunberg and all of the different strikes going on around the globe that day. And we had several thousand youth walk out of school to up to the Roundhouse to demand meaningful climate action from the governor.
That's Ani's kids, right?
Yeah. They're super cute, but they've always been super involved. In fact, you'll see them more throughout their presentation.
I know.
I think they're our youngest Yucca members. And then the next month we had our first kind of civil disobedience action, and so because the governor refused to meet even the kind of easiest to meet demand, which is declaring a climate emergency, she kind of ignored that. And so we had our first sit-in. We had 21 adult allies who we're really, really grateful for, and they risked their own personal safety and their bodies, and were arrested at this action. Then we also did a lot of legislative action and policy work. So here specifically, we like to do kind of like a lot of artistic or kind of theatrical actions to bring attention to an issue. So this one in particular, it was inspired by some other actions that were happening globally, but we adapted it to here. And so we have our young people kind of in the I guess gallows you would call it, up for the underneath the guillotine blade, with the ropes being suspended in ice blocks. I think the very direct symbolism, meaning that the more inaction that we have at the decisions we're making now is going to have very direct impacts on our future generations. And as the climate continues changing, it's going to result directly in people's deaths, specifically our future generations and our impacted communities. And we also did a lot to let our peers know about what was happening in the legislative session. We testified for and against bills, and taught our peers how to do so as well. And also got to meet with some legislators one-on-one to talk more about what we're pushing for. We also spoke up against toxic fracking water or produced water, and the lack of regulation around it. And so that was an action we had at the Roundhouse. And then, during the big election season, we did a lot of work. We endorsed over 20 county, state, and federal candidates, had a candidates forum, and had a voters guide. And we did a lot to really try and mobilize our whole community, but specifically youth. Like, for example, it was my first time ever voting, and it was super exciting to be a part of the process in that way. So then we also you'll see him there, you see them there again. We delivered the New Mexico Support Fracking Pause petition with New Mexico Justice. So that's something that they started. It had several thousand signatures asking the governor to support the fracking pause. And so this was outside of the governor's mansion. And again, with the kind of theatrical thing, we hosted a press conference at the same time, kind of pretending to be the oil and gas industry, giving Michelle Lujan Grisham an award for being such a good ally to them. So, it's kind of very sarcastic, but it gets the point across of, how she's been very much an ally to them and not necessarily for the people. We also hosted an El Ponte Leadership Academy to mentor our young people in the issues that we're facing, and had a 6-week internship so they could continue working on climate and climate policy and community development. And that kind of brings us up to where we're at, where once 2-year anniversary, we protested at with several hundred students outside of the Roundhouse for the climate strike, and protested outside of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association while the governor was speaking. And she was actually, we were doing that, unveiling her plans for hydrogen. So that's something that Jonathan can get into. But that's kind of where we're coming from and the kind of policy and action that we're looking at. But I'll pass it over to you, Jonathan.
Cool. I was going to kind of leave a little space for questions, but also I don't think, just stop me if there's any questions and we can get into that. But yeah, so this is going to be kind of like the second part of our presentation, a little bit more policy focused. And yeah, this is just going to be focusing on the fossil fuel industry's blue hydrogen facade. So yeah, so as I'm sure a lot of you have probably noticed, there is a lot of hydrogen hype really all across the country and the world, but we've really seen that play out firsthand here in New Mexico. We have at least two major hydrogen production bills that are in the works to be introduced this session, and they have large support from the governor. And we also have companies here in New Mexico, like Albuquerque-based biotech, already unveiling plans to, build hydrogen production hubs here in Albuquerque. They have plans to build at least two of these hubs here in Albuquerque in 2022, with plans to expand to other states across the country as well as the United Kingdom over 2022, 2023, and 2024. And yeah, so that's just, I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably noticed, but there is a lot of hype around hydrogen. And so yeah, so what, now that we know that there's a lot of hype around hydrogen, it's important to understand, what exactly is hydrogen power and what does it mean. So, there's several ways to produce hydrogen currently, but almost all of it relies on fossil fuel extraction. And that's through a process called steam reforming that essentially breaks methane down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. So the result of this process is what we know as gray hydrogen, or if technology is used to, capture the carbon dioxide that's produced in this process, then it becomes what's known as blue hydrogen because there is, in theory, no CO2 emitted in that process. And then the last one is called green hydrogen, and that is, where you break hydrogen and oxygen down from water. But the problem with that, and you can go to the next slide as well. The problem with that is that green hydrogen is, one, it's a very tiny percentage of the current market, so it makes up less than 1% of the hydrogen currently in production. And so what that means is that 99% of hydrogen consumption, which is mostly used for industrial purposes, is still derived from fossil fuel extraction or blue and gray hydrogen. And so, go ahead, next slide. And so yeah, so overall, it's just hydrogen is just a distraction. So we have green hydrogen, which is still really bad in a state like New Mexico because it's extremely water intensive. It might be economically competitive with existing technologies in 2050, but that's not fast enough. It's too little, too late. Especially when you look at the latest IPCC report that stated unequivocally that we have 8 years to cut our emissions in half. And this, it's not fast enough to match the pace of what we need to do to avoid catastrophic climate change. And so, really, hydrogen, regardless of, oh no, that's fine. Hydrogen, regardless of the color, is a distraction from these technologies. We have the solutions today. We don't need to be creating or investing in new ones. Particularly in New Mexico, we have such great potential for solar and wind energy. But we have the fossil fuel industry once again trying to disrupt this transition to a green economy. But this time it's through their methane polluted blue hydrogen facade. And yeah, and so all of that is just to say that hydrogen, regardless of any color, is just a distraction, whether it's gray, blue, or green. And yeah, so some key takeaways about hydrogen and hydrogen power. Is that hydrogen is an energy carrier. It's not an energy source. So, 99% of hydrogen production still relies on fossil fuel extraction because that energy has to come from another place. Again, hydrogen isn't an energy carrier. And the next, the carbon footprint. This is actually a recent study that came out of Cornell, but the carbon footprint of blue hydrogen is, at least 20% greater than burning coal or natural gas. And so, contrary to popular belief, this hydrogen, blue hydrogen or hydrogen in any color really isn't more environmentally friendly at all. It actually has a worse carbon footprint and is worse than just burning coal or natural gas for the same purposes.
Jonathan, we also, in 350, we also looked at how much water the green hydrogen took, and it's comparable to the amount of water that you use to produce the same kilowatt hours for coal. So unfortunately, the green hydrogen isn't really good for New Mexico either. So
Oh yeah, no.
just another little tidbit to add to all that.
Oh yeah, and especially when when at the end of the day, when it still relies on fossil fuel extraction, it's still relying on fracking, which takes an immense amount of water just to frack a single well, and then all of the I appreciate you saying that green hydrogen is still very dangerous for our state. And so next is hydrogen production in the U.S. is designed to really increase, or here in New Mexico is really designed to increase our reliance on the fossil fuel industry, while also distracting us from the proven solutions that already exist, like wind, solar, and energy storage capabilities. And lastly, and I think this is really important, and you'll see it particularly here in New Mexico, is that hydrogen is not being pushed by environmental justice community or environmental focused organizations. It's largely being pushed by the fossil fuel industry and their allies, and we see this mainly to protect their profits. And we see this in hydrogen. We see it in net zero by 2050 pledges, which are essentially giving to the fossil fuel industry a lifeline until 2050, and really just extending their time for profits, really. I go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of our 2022 legislative priorities, some specific notes. We plan to oppose the Governor's Hydrogen Hub Act, as well as oppose Representative Lundstrom's Hydrogen Development Act. And because both of these are dangerous false solutions, they rely on the false belief that hydrogen is a low emission fuel, which it is not. Again, it has at least a 20% greater carbon footprint than coal or natural gas. It provides several tax subsidies that will directly benefit the fossil fuel industry. They're calling it tax incentives and tax subsidies for hydrogen, but really that translates to more subsidies and more incentives for the fossil fuel industry, because they're the ones pushing this, and in large part they're the beneficiaries of this. And lastly, it really heavily increases our state's reliance on fossil fuel extraction, which is a really unstable and volatile way to get funds, as we've seen throughout the pandemic and throughout the past few years, when I remember the beginning of the pandemic, and barrels of oil were in the negative price range, and what that did to our local economy here, and the shock that we had around the country. So those are some of the specifics of what we're going to be opposing. We have some specific bills that we're going to be supporting this session. So we plan to support Representative Ortiz's Community Energy Efficiency Act, and so that is providing funds for low-income families to still participate in this transition to green appliances and a green economy. So making sure that solar and all other really beneficial initiatives aren't out of reach for our low-income families, and making sure that
is that the same thing as the low-income utility?
Yeah. So it is.
Okay,
So when I was talking to the representative, it's called the Low-Income Affordability Act. When I opened the bill number on the tracker on the website, it's called the Community Energy Efficient Development Grant or something. It is the same thing, but they had different names on paper and in the legislature. So, but yeah, they are the same.
I'm part of the 350 Rural and also the Rural Caucus, and I was really moved that some people in rural communities pay up to 37% of their budget goes to utilities. So people in rural communities especially spend too much money. So that's a really good one to support.
I completely understand, and I have a lot of family that lives in northern New Mexico, and I see that play out even within my own family, and what we're paying here in the city compared to them out there. So then we have next on our support list is some voting rights legislation, particularly this one. I found it, but I haven't found it filed yet, so I haven't seen a bill number stuff. But I know that it will be coming up this session, and that is voting rights legislation. And this particular one will have a provision that allows 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in our local elections. And that's really exciting, just, because I'm a strong believer that, if we give young people an opportunity to participate in our democracy while they're still in high school, that they are going to go further, or continue in their lives, knowing already, how to participate in that process, but also feeling like their voice actually matters and like they have a say. And I think it'll be particularly cool for like school board elections and things that, directly impact them, for them to have a say. Yeah. And then the last one, again, I know that this is coming up. I just couldn't find the specific like name or bill number for it, but that's going to be, protections for renters here in New Mexico that have applied for aid to whether it's aid for utilities or aid for rent, but, protecting them from eviction while they've applied for that aid. And so I think that's really important, because we've seen firsthand throughout this pandemic how dangerous it is to have sorry, I had a different train of thought. I was going to start talking about healthcare. But, we've seen firsthand throughout this pandemic the importance of eviction moratoriums and all these other things that, keeping people housed during a pandemic is very important. And even outside of a pandemic, I think it's important anyways. But, when people have, reached out for help and they've proven that they need that help, I think that it makes sense to, protect them from what is really state violence in the form of evictions. And yeah, so those are our legislative priorities, what we're opposing and what we're supporting. And, all of this to say that, these are going to be our top legislative goals in 2022. And these are actually the same goals that we've had for the past 3 years. And so, yeah, so I love the consistency. So, we have policies that, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Have you talked to Heinrich about hydrogen? Because I think he's supporting that.
I haven't personally, but yeah, I think we need to.
Yes, you definitely need to, because Steffi's right. He's pushing hydrogen, and he seems to be kind of misinformed on the drastic effects that if New Mexico becomes a hub, how it could really hurt us. So it would be great if you guys can get into his office.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And I think that I have an appreciation for Heinrich, because out of all of our national delegation, he's been one of the ones that consistently, when we do get into that room and are able to have those conversations, he's been one to listen, and he's been one to back that. He was one of the first to listen to us and sign on to the Green New Deal and all these other things. But all that to say that, we'll have to push to get into his office and have that conversation, because like you said, I think it's really important that we're all on the same page, especially because, like I said, I think his heart's in the right place. I think he's just misinformed, like you said.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so these are our legislative goals for 2022. Wait, go back real quick. I didn't get to go through the goal. So policies that end our dependency on fossil fuel extraction and create actionable plans to transition our economy. Policies that keep fossil fuels in the ground. Policies that promote renewable energies, and policies that expand democracy and justice. And so, yeah, so I think you can kind of see how each of our, what we're opposing and supporting kind of fits into those goals. And then, some to kind of like end this is, I really want to, pose this question. And I think that a lot of folks in the room kind of are on the same note around this. So I'm really glad about that. We're on the same page. But, I really wanted to, pose the question is, we've heard a lot recently, particularly with, Governor Grisham going to COP26 with President Biden, as well as just, it's been thrown around by Democrats across the state and across the country that, New Mexico is leading the path for the country on leading the country on a path towards, renewable energies and towards carbon neutrality. But, I really want to push back against that, because the numbers don't line up there. We saw, as the Rio Grande ran dry for miles at a stretch this past year in 2021, it was also a record-breaking year for our state's oil and gas industry, which averaged, 1.6 million barrels of crude oil and 6.19 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day in March of 2021. Both the oil and gas industries saw more than 10% increase in production since February. And then in April of this year, our state netted $109 million from oil and gas production. And that's the highest profit in the history of the fossil fuel industry in New Mexico. And then lastly, I added this last night, but in May of 2021, New Mexico actually became the second largest producer of oil and gas in the country. So we surpassed North Dakota. And so, I include this because it doesn't make sense to me for us to be labeled as a leader leading us on the path towards carbon neutrality, and for our governor to be lauded as the climate, as a model climate governor, when the reality is that she's actually increasing our dependency on fossil fuels, and she's not wanting to include our statewide emissions in what we export, only wanting to talk about New Mexico's carbon footprint, and not the oil and gas that's extracted here that then gets shipped to other parts of the world to be emitted.
Now, that's not part of her net zero. Scope 3 emissions are not part of net zero for New Mexico.
No, exactly.
And that's why I couldn't get any teachers unions to sign on to our UNM complaint. No, because NMOGA is so good at.
Yeah. And then just to kind of wrap this up is, despite everything I just said, and our states, one, our loyalty to fossil fuel CEOs, which I think some people may not want to hear, but I think it's very obvious. And then also our sorry, I'm like blanking on the words, but yeah, despite our loyalty to fossil fuel CEOs and our dependency on them, the ways in which our economy and our education and all these things have kind of been wrapped up in their revenues and made for us to be dependent on them. We also have some of the highest potential for renewables in the country. We have some of the highest potential for solar and wind. I really think it's just up to us to find the courage and really live up to that potential, because we definitely can be the leader, a leader in carbon neutrality and all these things that we talked about. We just have to find it within ourselves to do that and actually hold the fossil fuel industry accountable. I think I'll kind of pass it back to Seneca if there's any questions. But yeah, I think that kind of went almost perfectly along with the amount of time we had allotted. So let us know if there's any questions, or we can just have a conversation. But yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. I'd like to just point to two things. I've been half in this expo this morning and half I'm listening to the water conference that's going on. And one of the things that they're pointing out is that the state and water engineer quit partly because he, for like the third year in a row, was asked to not request more money than for the state engineer's office, flat budget levels. And it's very hard I don't understand, and maybe you guys do, how to press the governor to increase, particularly this time when we have all this revenue from oil and gas. How can we make the governor put more money into water, into the state engineers fund? Because we're losing what institutional memory we have, and we desperately need to be planning for less water in their state, because we're the most water vulnerable state in the nation, and climate change is going to just be reducing the water that we have in the future. So I don't know how you do that politically, put that pressure on the governor to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't have an answer either, because I feel like she must have seen the numbers by now. So I don't know. Logically, it doesn't make sense to me. But I don't know. I think we're gonna, of course, continue to have actions, trying to put pressure on the governor and increasing what they're called, like public, just like public knowledge. Because I think a lot of people, these are issues that they're affected by and that they care about, but they just might not necessarily know about. Similar to hydrogen, I think a lot of the people that I've talked to, like, I kind of have to introduce the entire subject to them because they just have not, been able to be informed about it. And so I think that's one way, is just, massively increasing public knowledge. But yeah, Senator, I see you raised your hand.
I guess I'll jump in and comment on that. I think we, like the work that Seneca's doing and Yucca and other groups, we need that. There needs to be pressure to the governor to say, this is what people in our state want. This has to happen. There also has to be pressure on me as a legislator, to do this as well. But what I will say is a lot of the influence has to happen with members on Senate Finance and on House Appropriations. So as a senator that's only designee on LFC and not on finance, a lot of times these priorities and what the budgets are done really without my input, or it's really given to us on the session to vote on. And by the time it's there and you send me the emails or you call me to say we need to bump this up, it's really too late to do that. So it has to happen throughout the year. If we're trying to work on this next year, it has to happen, during the interim committees. I have a voice to talk with members and make it aware in the interim committees that this needs to happen. I know that I was in a meeting and they were talking about this, but you're right. What we're getting from the budget from the executive is not showing an increase. So I think we need to also put pressure on Senate Finance and Appropriations to bump up the budget there. And hopefully, I guess one thing that can happen, we saw what happened from the governor's budget, and we see what came in from LFC. The hope is that, maybe if it's more an LFC, that we go with what the LFCs put out. But I think that's really where we're at, is you really have to push Senate Finance members. And I'm not saying go send them emails, don't attack these folks. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just trying to tell you the realities of how we're structured in the House and the Senate. They have a lot of influence on the budget and what happens there. And unfortunately, if you're not a member on the committee, I just don't have as much influence on that. So just being honest.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I know we are pretty far over time, but is there any other questions or comments or anything before we close?
I thought this was a great presentation, so thank you for giving the updates on everything that Yucca is doing, and thank you for that information, Pope, about influencing the budget. That was really informative. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thank you everyone so much for being here, for listening to our presentation, and for engaging in this conversation. We're really happy to be able to be in this space with you all, and I just really appreciate it. If you want to stay up to date with what Yucca is doing and what we're going to be doing in the upcoming session, you can follow us. We have our social media like Instagram at yucca.nm. You can also join our email listserv where we'll update about what's happening in the upcoming session and any actions we may be planning, and calls to action, that sort of thing. But yeah, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being here.